Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Just get into it. No one else has anything else to talk about. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Partu. Joining me today is
a geek for fun,
and Steve.
I know those guys. Yep. So we're here for another topic discussion, and I don't know how much we'll get out of this one, but it's just kind of been on my mind lately. So no pressure. We'll just talk as much as we can. 3-hour video. So I want to talk about the distinction between things that are good versus things that just were important. Because I feel like, I'll just be honest, what brought this on is I was watching in the Discord as a bunch of people were talking about Watchmen and how they didn't actually really like it that much. And I'm like, have we come to the point where Watchmen isn't actually celebrated because it's good or groundbreaking or anything? We just are acknowledging that it was really important for the time it came out. And there's just, I think, a lot of books, novels, films, comics, movies, operas, I don't know.
Operas?
Yeah, Name a good opera.
I mean, I don't know if any of us are qualified to talk about opera.
But just that idea of is something, how much of something being good is about when it comes out versus how much something will stand the test of time and remain good, years, decades, centuries later. Because there's classic novels where you read them today and it's oh man, I can see how at the time this must have been so groundbreaking. But now it's just become the way to do it. So now it just feels trite or amateurish. It was important, it was groundbreaking for the time, but now, because it was so formative, this is just how we do things now. So without it having that groundbreaking feel, suddenly it's just not very good. So yeah, that's the main premise. And I guess I'm curious for both of you if you think that. Can you think of an example where something is very important but is also just not very good?
I can let Steve go ahead if you want to.
No, you can go first.
So when you mentioned this topic, I think it's a really good topic. It's something I think about a lot as well. Just in general, from whenever I see things talked about, or if I'm going back myself and reading a lot of classics, and just kind of comparing eras is something that seems to be more and more prominent the more access people have to archives and records, where any movie in the world that you want to see that has ever existed, you can go back and watch pretty easily on the internet. Any book or something, you can scour it and find it in ways where we have access to now the breadth of human history in a way that we didn't used to. And I feel like that's led to an influx of conversations like this more recently, the last 20 years or so. So I think that all kind of leads to this, you're mandated to go check these things out, and then it kind of feels like homework, or especially when you're younger, I feel like there's distinct phases of where, especially when you're a creative person, where you kind of want to say fuck the classics, like inherently, because when you're told something is like a masterwork, it's almost like priming you when you're young, kind of like I'm smarter than you teenager, to be looking for flaws or looking for reasons for why it sucks, even if they're not like actually justifiable reasons. And then when you get older and you have more of a perspective in life, maybe it connects you in a different way. So I think we might have all have had examples like that. In terms of like something that actually sticks out to me as this is very historically important, but it doesn't do a lot for me. I'd probably say the biggest thing I've had with that recently would be like Animal Farm. Um, and when I read that, I thought it was really good for like the first half, and then it fell off pretty hard for me in terms of keeping me engaged. But then reading about it and reading about people's interpretations of it, and Steve did this really good essay about the Tom King adaptation recently, and he did a bit of like preamble at the start where he like went through all the different interpretations and how people kind of missed the point of it, right? And I thought all that stuff was really interesting, and more interesting than the process of reading the book itself, which I think is funny. And I think that can happen to a lot of great works. In terms of something that I've been talking about a lot with people recently, so it's funny that this came up. Superman 78 with Richard Donner is a movie that's never really worked for me, but is one that is absolutely a genre-defining industry shake-up film that's very historically important and like something that will stand the test of time for people, but it's not something I'm ever really going to have like that good of a watch with. But I will always keep coming back to it, because anytime there's something new, it kind of reframes it, because everything will always, even non-Superman things, will always somewhat be playing off Donner in a lot of ways. And I think that's a more modern example for people.
How about you, Steve? Do you think there's an example of something where it's like just more important than good, or more good than important?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a complicated answer, and then there's a boring answer. And the boring answer is it depends, obviously. It depends on what you mean by good. It depends on what you mean by important. It depends on whether or not you think important is a part of something being good, and what about something makes it important to begin with, like when it came out or the craft behind it or whatever. So like it's always gonna be in flux. I think the more sort of complicated answer is when you talk about things being important versus good, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to have that distinction if you aren't at the same time trying to understand what you mean by the word good, as far as like good as in you like it and you want to watch it again, or you enjoy the process, or the things about it that are important are the things that you are deriving joy from. So like for me, for example, like when I watch something or read something and I really like it, my brain immediately goes to like, how does this work? Why is the lettering doing this thing that makes me feel this way? Why is the camera in this position and it makes me feel this way? So like, for me, craft is where the fun is, and what makes something good is whether it's well crafted. And a lot of times being well crafted goes hand in hand with something being historically important. Citizen Kane's always been a really good example of like the cliche greatest movie of all time that everyone jokes about being the greatest movie of all time. But then, you know, a few years ago when I sat down and watched it, I'm like, I could legitimately see an argument for this being the greatest movie of all time because of just how well crafted it is, not just for its era, but just in general.
And the dinosaurs.
Yeah, you know, of course, the dinosaur stock footage is awesome. But so like, it's always going to depend. I think the only medium where this is a legitimate sort of divide, regardless of your like preference for good or important, is video games. I think video games are in a really shitty position where, because they're so dependent on modes of technology that are going to go out of date, on the fact that there's no serious archiving efforts, on the fact that they're limited by their physical interfaces and hardware no matter what, means that you're always going to have examples of video games that are important before they're good, just because there's no way to like go back and make the hardware in a way that's compatible with what the game's trying to do most of the time. A lot of classic...
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I just think that was like a good... Because that was one of the things I was going to bring up is like, oh, video games, I think of the example when all of them are good from like the industry thing, which I think is a good contrast. I guess we can talk about a bit later. Sorry, I didn't mean to just. I was literally thinking about that as you said your point. I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, no, video games are the big one for me, and I'm sure Matt will leave something in the comments. But I mean, there's been so many video games in my life where like I know of them and I understand them because I've played remasters or emulators and stuff. But that's a very different thing than playing the game the way it came out and then getting frustrated because the system it came out on like notoriously sucks or whatever. Pokemon games historically are like this for me, where like I really don't want to fucking play Crystal on my Game Boy Advance, but I kind of have to play it on the Game Boy Advance to understand what about it is great. But
that's insane. How could you not want to play Pokemon on the original? All right, we'll get to it. That's like say you don't want to see an IMAX movie in an IMAX theater. That's insane to me. I would kill to be able to get like a Sega Mega Drive. And go ahead.
I love playing most of the Pokemon games on Game Boy as I did as a kid. As an adult, I've played a lot of them on emulators because just my laptop is going to have a better screen resolution than my Game Boy Advance did. And that's just what I mean. Like as a kid, you play your Pokemon games on Game Boy Advance and it's so much fucking fun. And then as an adult, you want to go back to it. And hunching over on a shitty little Game Boy Advance as an adult is a lot harder to do than just hooking up an emulator. And that's where like the dissonance comes in, where I'm like, look, you got to play Emerald. Emerald's a great game. But you have to play it on an emulator because playing it on a Game Boy would fucking suck right now because you're spoiled on shit like the Nintendo Switch. But the other example I wanted to throw out too, that I think this is a really good sharp divide, is Bruce Lee movies. Bruce Lee movies are really important for the evolution of Hong Kong cinema, for the evolution of martial arts and its representation in the U.S., for the development of UFC, for how fight scenes are done in American films and Asian films. But they're just not good. They're just not. They're really hard to watch sometimes. I like Fist of Fury. I can get through like 40% of Big Boss. I can get through a lot of Enter the Dragon. I can't watch Way of the Dragon. Bruce Lee movies are definitely one where I'm like, I get it, but I don't want to watch it.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought of Bruce Lee movies. Because, like, for me, the thing I immediately thought of was, like, or the thing that like sparked the thought for this for me was just people talking about Watchmen, and like, see, that's how I kind of feel about like a lot of Alan Moore's stuff. Whenever I read it, with like one exception of Killing Joke, because that's just, it's got my favorite character and whatnot. But anytime I read Alan Moore's stuff, I'm like, I mean, it's well done, but like, best comic of all time, like genius writer, I don't know if I'd go that far. Like, it's good. I can see how at the time this was really groundbreaking and like really interesting, but do you think we're putting it on too high a pedestal now?
No.
30, 40 years after it's come out?
I don't think so with Alan Moore. I think if you keep a pulse on superhero comics, everyone goes through this phase, everyone, including me, where like you think year one, Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen are overrated and you don't like them and you complain about them. And then you're like, we've gotten so much better than this. But then you look at, if your frame of reference is just American big two superhero comics, that's a very common conclusion to come to. But like, I think if you really do sit down with Watchmen, it's like far and away, Watchmen is better than anything DC or Marvel have published in like the last 20 years, bar none. I don't think there's a single comic book Marvel and DC have published in the 21st century that comes close to Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns or Batman Year One. And it's just one of those things where it's like, there are going to be people who have a preference to not read that kind of stuff, and they like the newer stuff, and that's fine. But I think it'd be a very silly opinion to be like, and I love Tom King, so don't hold this against me. I think Tom King's the best writer working at DC. I think it would be a very silly opinion to be like, yeah, man, Tom King Rorschach, better than Watchmen. Yeah, man, Tom King Mr. Miracle, better than Watchmen. Come on now. That's not even, I think that's an unserious opinion.
So, I agree with your point, Steve. I also think, like, for Watchmen specifically, when we can talk about maybe some other Alan Moore works, but for Watchmen specifically, even though it's not something I really get, like, entertained by, I think just on, like, a craft level, like, Gibbons stuff specifically, with, like, the scene transitions and stuff, I do think it deserves still to be in the pedestal. In the NBA, they talk like in the conversation, right? Like the GOAT conversation, the GOAT debate. I think it should definitely be in the conversation. I think it's more than worth being in that. And then you can pick your faves from that, but it has to be in that like pool of like 5 comments or whatever have you. But to defend Ian's thing a little bit as well, is I think we have seen a lot of people that is a natural phase. And I think I kind of had a little phase like that. I don't think where Ian's coming from is necessarily a phase. I think in 10 years' time, Ian's going to have the same opinion on Alan Moore like he had last time we talked.
I'm not saying, Ian, I'm sorry, I'm not saying that you're going through a phase. I just mean like when you're talking about the conversation around Watchmen, I think this is a debate about Watchmen people have had for years, and it always comes to the same conclusion, which is, I guess we're still reading Watchmen, because it's the best thing Marvel or DC has done, ever.
I don't know. It's not one of those things where I'm going to point out problems with it or anything. If we're talking craft-wise, yeah, it's well done, but it just feels like... I just feel like because of the gates that it opened up, it's one of the things where you go back to it, and I've just read so many of their books since then that I feel do a lot of what it's trying to do, maybe in individual issues, better. Like you mentioned Tom King's Mr. Miracle. I connected emotionally with Mr. Miracle in a way that nothing did for me in Watchmen.
And that's fair. I think it's totally fair to be like, you appreciate Watchmen more than you like it. And this is where I kind of go back to the beginning point of like, being good and being important are not always different things. Where part of what a person means by being good is it well crafted, whereas another person might say part of being good is, do I want to go back and read it again? And if your metric for being good is, I take enjoyment out of the emotions I feel while reading it, that's totally fine. And then to you, maybe the important side slides out of it. But if you're like me and you take joy in how something is crafted and that makes you emotionally engaged, then you read something like that, and being important is a big chunk of what qualifies as good for me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's totally a fair and legitimate debate. But I think outside of that debate, I think it's kind of silly to say Watchmen is anything but like the quintessential superhero comic. Because I think there's a lot of great superhero comics that have been written in the last 20 years by Marvel and DC. Most of them by Tom King, because I really like Tom King. But at the end of the day, right, like, I don't think we're going to be having debates in 40 years about, like, how Mr. Miracle changed superhero comics. As good as it is, Tom King's whole thing is that he's Diet Alan Moore.
Oh,
but I think...
Go ahead, Ian.
Go ahead, Alfie. No, you go ahead.
All right, because I just have a direct response to that, what I think is an interesting aspect of this, and it kind of goes to the comparison I gave of like the whole like GOAT debate thing. Is I think when you have these things that you view as like the quintessential or like the definitive, when you give them that this is the best thing we've ever seen, and normally when those things come across, it's pretty like universal at the time. When they came out, and I think social media has a big difference in this, in where who gets to comment on what is viewed as influential has expanded a lot more, so it's much harder to be viewed as definitive now than when the voice pool was much smaller. It's kind of like anything pre-social media age, I think, is kind of predestined to never reach the same kind of embedded highs that anything prior did, just because of how we talk about it. Like, it's an inherent, like, you're not going to get the same level of universal appreciation. And that goes for everything. That goes for movies, that goes for comics, especially comics, where, like, the comic discourse scene is so different now. And comic critics now are, like, the blue sky post a day versus actually being an actual, respected critic thing. Like, it's very different. So my question to that would be, is do you feel like evolution of a medium and people building on and learning from what people have done prior in these works. Like I know Gillen, for example, the name of it escapes me, but he did a work entirely about Watchmen and the 9-panel grid and the limitations of the 9-panel grid, and offered up
Thunder something.
Thunder. Yeah, I guess something Thunder, right?
Fuck, I can't remember. I know what you're talking about.
But it's like
Peter
inherently
Cannon Thunderbolt?
That's it. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt.
Yeah, Peter, there you go. Perfect. Thank you, Ian. But he was very much approaching Watchmen from a perspective of, like, this has been done, we can improve and move the medium forward kind of thing. Now, with comics specifically, I think you have more of an argument for Watchmen did just kind of peak it, because comic industry, by the predatory practices and by the people in charge, it's been very hard to make any kind of artistic progress in that medium, especially like Big Two comics. It's really, really difficult to move that industry forward. Even in the manga side of things, like, it's very, very hard on that schedule to get someone who could beat Toriyama at what he did, for example. Like, the deck's kind of stacked against you. But I do think it's worth considering that the passage of time in general does seem to lead to an increase in craft quality, simply because once someone has figured something out that no longer becomes innovative, it becomes standard.
Yeah, yes and no. I'm mixed on that. There's part of the problem with that is, I think you do have to kind of start defining the parameters of a specific medium when you have these conversations. Because when you say important and influential, or gets borrowed from a lot, you do have to kind of zoom in and say, okay, borrowed from and influential to what? To whom? To what subset of a specific kind of medium? Like John Carpenter's Halloween is really influential. It's really influential in a lot of ways, but it's specifically really influential for slasher movies. And slasher movies having something be important is a very different thing than American movies having something that are important, or movies as a medium having something important in them. And that's kind of another sort of subset of the Watchmen debate, is like, it's a debate in the space of people whose primary preoccupation is the evolution of Marvel and DC superhero comics. In that space, it's a giant, and in that space, it revolutionized a lot of techniques that people copy now. But like, when you zoom out and you start thinking about the fact that comic books have been an industry independent of the superhero stuff longer than there have been superhero stuff, you start to have a wider perspective of, like, important means something different in every place. And part of what Alan Moore did is not unlike a lot of other famous genre authors like Bram Stoker with Dracula, where he's compiling a lot of things from around the medium and bringing them to superhero comics in a way that no one else had done up to that point. They were innovative for Marvel and DC, and they were innovative for how they were combined. But these are all things that have been there in the medium if you look wider. And so this is why I think, like, the distinction between important and good can be kind of tricky, because important's always going to be relative to what subset you're kind of talking about. And when you start breaking it up into those little categories, it starts to become a little bit more elusive than if you just think about important in terms of, like, craft and in terms of what it's doing as a function inside of the story. Because you have so many things that are influential and important because they come up with a technique. But that doesn't mean that they were the best to utilize the technique. And it doesn't mean that that technique caught on in that same way in other parts of that very same medium, right? Like, 9-panel grids in Watchmen are a very specific thing, but they're a very different thing in that book than they are in, like, a Tope Italian comic or something like that. So, like, it's that's why it's a little bit weird to me. I think when you talk about something that is sort of more confined, like video games, where it's always confined by the limits of what the hardware is doing, you have a little bit more runway. But when you're talking about something like comics or movies, these debates about being important can end up getting kind of insular. and they start focusing on only very particular things. TV is a really good example of this too, right? There's a really famous essay about the idea that TV can't be revolutionary or inventive because the way TV works inherently is you do a thing, and once it's good, the only way for it to proceed is to repeat itself constantly and for other people to repeat it constantly until someone does something different, at which point comes the thing everyone repeats. And you hear that in like the 1960s, and that sounds ridiculous. But then 60 years later, you're like, yeah, that's just the nature of TV. It just keeps repeating because that's the way it's designed. So I do think like when we're talking about like that tendency to borrow the same tricks and divorce yourself from the originator to is it just working within the story, that can get tricky because you have to really kind of focus on who exactly is your audience when you say that.
I don't know. I think you make a really good point about like how subtle this distinction can be. I think this also like begins to drift over into the but does it hold up kind of discussion. And I don't know. I have complicated feelings on the matter, I think is what this comes down to.
It's inherently like an open-ended question as well. Like I don't think there is an answer to that. I think it is just kind of like either case by case, and a lot of it is informed by your own personal, like what scratches that itch better for you at the end of the day. Like we can be as intellectual as possible. We can try and narrow it down, but like at the end of the day, like if you're guns to the head and you've got a rack of things to choose from, what's you picking first, right? And there's like a gut level primal this made my brain happy aspect to it, and it doesn't have to be anti-intellectual. In a lot of ways that's the truest expression of it because it made you feel something, right? Like that's very much a pure thing, and that can be something that was made over 100 years ago at this point, or could it be something that was made literally that came out last week and it just hit you in a way that it's forever enshrined. So I think there's a lot of it's good to have the wider talk about it, but at the same time I think there is an inherent personal thing that makes discussing it even fun. So I like having that like inherent like personal aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to at the end of the day, and this is the sort of problem with the social media way of doing things, is that you're always kind of forcing yourself to pick sides on this kind of stuff. But I think really what's important is if you like something, then don't be sealed off from other things that could have influenced it, and don't shove your curiosity out the window just because you have a relationship to this one thing, even if it's not for some people the best expression of it, or maybe it is. Like if you really like a particular comic or a particular movie, that's fine. But like when someone says this is a really influential thing and this is part of the lineage of this thing that you like, I think part of liking that thing is that you have an intellectual obligation to be like, let me go back to this other thing. Let me see what about it influenced the thing that I like. And maybe by doing that, I can come to a deeper appreciation of the thing I like. Or maybe I can realize that there's a different thing that I'm interested in altogether. People got like really, really pissy when Dune Part 2 came out, and people were pointing out like how influential Dune was on Star Wars, as if somehow like that made Star Wars less good just because Dune had an influence on it, as opposed to just being like, hey man, I like Star Wars. If Dune influenced Star Wars, let me read Dune and be like, what about Dune do I like that makes me appreciate Star Wars more? Or maybe there's something about Dune that can push me in a different parallel direction because I picked up on other things that would influence me. Like just be curious, right? Like if you're watching something and you have a gut reaction, or if you're reading something and you have a gut reaction and you have a feeling, having the feeling is good. Having a positive feeling, negative feeling, that's good. But I think there is a part of you that has a sort of intellectual obligation to be like, why am I feeling this way? And can I afford to be a little bit more curious about branching out because of this feeling so that I have a deeper understanding of it?
And also, if you can't fight the feeling anymore, and you maybe forget what you started fighting for, then you can like crawl along the floor, come crashing through the door.
That too. Said in a tone that hopefully will not get copyright flagged.
Exactly.
You never know these days.
Dude, do you know how like much of an ego boost it would be for me if my voice was good enough to get copyright flagged?
I would be impressed. I wouldn't even be mad.
Yeah, that's kind of a flex.
Can't even.
Yeah, I'm such a good singer that like even me just singing the song without any musical backing or whatever gets identified as the original song. I'm that fucking good, bro.
You just need to pivot the channel to like dramatic readings of songs.
I could do the William Shatner thing. Did you ever hear William Shatner's Common People?
Yes.
Oh
That
my
shit's
fucking
so
god,
funny.
it goes so hard. It goes so hard though.
There's a dude on YouTube who did a dramatic reading of the Yu-Gi-Oh theme song, the English one, and it's like you, gi, oh, you.
I love that.
It's so fucking good.
Okay, so this is, I think, talking about William Shatner got me to think about this. I think the original series of Star Trek is mostly one of those things where it was like really important at the time it came out, but also just does not hold up at all, and is mostly bad. Like not even just for the time it was important, and we've used these. No, like now actively we've moved so far beyond it that it's just laughable. Like everyone would point to the like fight scene with the fucking lizard dude that just looks so terrible. But like fight cinema has come so far that like that's not even where you start. Like just the very nature of Star Trek being like this idea of humanity evolving past its infancy and shit. And yet it's still so produced in a time that it can't even be aware of its own contradictions of itself. So you have like Muds women or Turnabout Intruder that are just like some of the most blatantly like sexist things you could possibly do. And then like there's things that Star Trek the original series was praised for at the time, as and seen as like so progressive. Whoopi Goldberg has like the famous story of she was flipping through channels as a kid, and then she yells, Mom, there's a black woman on TV, and she's not a maid." And, like, that's such a big and impactful moment for her. And what does Uhura do? She answers the fucking phone.
She's a secretary.
Yeah, like, that's the thing. It's, like, it's something that prided itself so much on its progressiveness. The first interracial kiss on film, or not on film, but on television, in America, it's such a big deal. Like, yeah, for the time, but, like, I don't even remember the fucking context of that, but Kirk was fucking kissing everybody, man.
Yeah, and
it's...
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, it's like, not only was he kissing everyone, but, like, Kirk's chauvinism and like, the failings of the sexism on things. And it's so blatant that, like, not even that long late after, right? So, like, Star Trek has its initial run in the late 60s, and then you have Next Generation kick up in, like, the mid-80s. So you're not even talking about, like, you're talking about less than a 20-year age gap, where the flaws of the thing were so evident that they, like, run away from and go out of their way to not address the flaws that the original series makes by the time they get their shot at it again. So I think that's like one where like there's still good episodes of the original series, but like you have to put yourself in a certain headspace in order to appreciate them. Of like, I'm gonna have to sit through some shit to get to the goal at the end of the tunnel here.
And this is where I think this thing I keep going back to kind of comes up, where like maybe part of the reason Star Trek the original series is so good is exactly for all those reasons you just said. Because it's ripe with contradictions, because it's got all of these elements that historically it was praised for that in the context don't work in that way. And part of the joy of watching that show is watching it struggle with those contradictions. I mean, the heart of Star Trek TOS was Kirk's at the center. McCoy is his emotional brain and Spock is his rational brain. And every moral dilemma they face, Kirk is swinging one way or the other between who's in his ear, between McCoy and Spock. And most of the time, he just ends up doing his own thing. And this vision of
do my own thing.
what the Star Trek universe would be in the midst of the Cold War, and everything that tells you about those historical contradictions that you're talking about is what makes it so interesting anyway. Like, a big part of what makes something important is how historically we revisit it and we reevaluate it and talk about it in relation to its context and how it's evolved. You think about movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, and how when they came out, they were part of the early slasher phase, and then decades go on, and you've got sequels and remakes and etc. And Wes Craven comes back to do New Nightmare, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare's the whole thing about that movie is Craven's going back and looking at what the cultural impression of Nightmare on Elm Street was, and what it meant for him as an artist, and what it meant for the actors as people. The fact that the woman who plays Nancy was stalked in real life, and that becomes a plot in the meta movie of New Nightmare of her character who's really herself in real life getting stalked. Like, that's part of what I think some people appreciate about things like Star Trek TOS is they go back and they watch this and they're like, so much of this doesn't work, and that's why it's so good and it's so interesting, because there's so much about it that's worth unpacking. And there's so much about it that's like in contention with its own premise and in contention with its own historical period. And to Star Trek's credit, it runs away from the Gene Roddenberry vision fairly quickly, because you've got TOS and you've got TNG in 87. But then the best Star Trek show, in my opinion, is Deep Space Nine. And Deep Space Nine is the one that says, let's throw out all of the morality tales of Gene Roddenberry and do a show where people can infight, do a show where the characters are being tested by their own moral codes, not by a moral principle that the whole show is trying to achieve. And you watch TNG and Deep Space Nine next to each other, and it makes TNG better because you're getting a chance to see how the ideals fail in human hands. And then it makes DS9 better because you're watching bad people try to construct ideals.
It's interesting because I like... This will turn into a whole fucking Star Trek discussion, so I'm just going to make this point. We'll have this argument some other day. I like DS9 quite a bit. It's a really good story. I'm still very disappointed that they felt the need to abandon the vision of Roddenberry, and I think it leads to the fact that people just have a very limited imagination, that they can't imagine how to tell a good story without dealing with interpersonal drama. So, put a pin in that for another day. My take on it is, yeah, it's a well-written show, but it's not a very inspiring show. And I'm more inspired by the idea of, are we incapable of imagining utopia, and what does that say about us?
Yeah, and not arguing with you, but just adding to your point, and that's part of why DS9's existence makes TNG better. Because TNG is the exercise to try and do that. And its attempts to do it well, when it does do it well, are great. And its attempts to not do it so well, and when it messes up, are what make that so interesting. So, like, having both of these shows happen concurrently, you end up with things that are important because of how they're competing historically and talking about Gene Roddenberry's vision. And that's part of what makes them good, because the more you watch them, the more engrossed you are in that struggle of trying to figure out how that works and how it doesn't. Andor, just to kind of pivot a little bit, Andor is another really good example of this. Andor, I think, is like the best Star Wars thing ever, and a lot of people accuse it of being not really like Star Wars, like it's just a political thriller in the Star Wars universe, and they dismiss it. But part of what makes Andor so good is that when you step outside of George Lucas's vision for what Star Wars is supposed to be, and you have someone try and make what they feel like the iconography of Star Wars can do in a current context, and it makes that whole universe a lot more messy, it retroactively makes everything better. Because you have, on the one end of the spectrum, George Lucas's Vietnam War allegory in the Star Wars original trilogy, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Tony Gilroy's allegory about the genocide in Gaza in the form of Andor, and you put these two things together, and you're like, George Lucas and Tony Gilroy are actually doing very similar things. They're taking the same tools to tell very similar stories, but they're coming at it from two different historical perspectives, and that's what makes them so interesting. Star Wars, like TOS, is about the moral principles that George Lucas wants to interrogate and put into the universe. Like DS9, Andor is about characters confronting their inability to live up to their own moral principles.
Cool. Alfie, fucking talk.
Wow, I talked a lot up front. I just wanted to make sure you guys got everything you wanted to say. I was interrupting people a lot. My main thing with all of this is I completely agree. I think it's really interesting when you can just take something in a new place, and you can not. I just hate whenever people limit themselves by what's come before, like so rigidly, why they put like a ceiling on things, and that's why I do get like struggle when people like get very definitive about something that came beforehand, is like, oh, you're never gonna top this. Like a personal example that's really kind of like it doesn't like make me angry, it just annoys me at this point, is I'm getting really tired of when people just like give up on making a new Superman theme, so they just reuse the Donna music all the time. And I'm just like, that's a really great iconic track, but like I like to see new interpretations of I think you can still do more than that. I think you can still find a new angle on the character. I think you can still find something for that. And I always struggle a lot when people like will say, oh, this is so good, it's never gonna be beaten ever. And I'm like, well, you can at least try, even if that is the case. Like, what does that say? Why even bother creating any more pieces of art whatsoever if everything has a greatest version already that won't be topped? Because you can list, like, there's an example for that for every single piece of art ever, like music, movies, shows, anything. Like, there is an example that people think is the greatest of all time that won't be topped. And I'm just like, isn't that kind of, like, inherently anti-creative? I use that as motivation. I was like, oh, well, what if you could, though? What if you just took all those elements, you've seen that, they didn't have the luxury of being able to watch, like, Breaking Bad or whatever, when they're making a TV show. They had to just make Breaking Bad on the fly. You've seen it, you know what worked, you know what didn't. You can do the next thing that's better than that, or someone. I think that's, like, one example, but I always get that in my head as kind of... I think a lot of that comes down to like Doctor Who being very specific, like child brain, and being very forward pushing. At least at the time.
Remember when Doctor Who was good?
But like the whole thing of the actor can change, right? Like, you don't have to have a performance that is set in stone, which I think is like another aspect that people don't get, like, outside of just things. Like, people get very much like on the, oh, Hugh Jackman is Wolverine, he will never be topped as Wolverine, or Robert Downey Jr. is Iron Man. It's like, you haven't even seen anyone else try yet. Like, you've only had the one. Like, and it was a good one, right? But like, when people get that in the weeds about something, it just has to be the best ever. You can't imagine something new. And if you try that, if you even hint that, oh, maybe we could try something new, it's seen as an offense against the original thing because you're not appreciating its greatness enough. That always bugs me.
I remember a while ago, this would have been a long time ago, I don't know, like maybe just like a couple years at least, but I posted on Twitter at some point about rewatching the Dark Knight Returns animated movie, and I said something about like, man, it's so cool to see what's the fuck's his name? Peter Cullen? Peter Peter Cullen voiced Batman in this, and how he kind of has an Adam West edge to it, and how it kind of feels like what Frank Miller was actually going for at the time. And then some guy responded like, Kevin Conroy, best Batman. I'm like, come on, dude. Wasn't even talking about that. Who said that? What in my post made you think that this was a natural response?
I still wanted Clint Eastwood to voice Dark Knight Returns Batman.
Oh, it's so good. It would have been so good.
Yeah, no, Alfie, I'm with you, and I think part of the getting stuckness is the other end of this important thing, right? When something's a milestone in its respective genre or field, it's really hard to go away from it, even though the fact that it was a milestone had so much to do with it being different or weird or not the thing you would think about. Like, people were upset when Hugh Jackman was cast as Wolverine. He's too tall to be Wolverine. He's Australian. He does musical theater. What the fuck are you doing? And how quickly does that turn around when the first X-Men movie comes out, and now everyone's like, obviously Hugh Jackman is the best Wolverine. Well, the thing about that at the end of the day is you're just kind of getting stuck praising this thing because it was important and different, and you're not letting it move forward. But the other sort of end of this is, in order for it to move forward, you have to have an audience and creative people who are willing to do things differently, which we just don't have a lot of anymore, and that's what makes this really tough, where things are so forced into these boxes of nostalgia bait lately, like Deadpool and Wolverine, where if you were going to get the X-Men into the MCU, perfect time to recast them. The fact that they feel the need to harp on the Fox X-Men universe to feel like that's how they get people into seats, that's the thing that both energizes people who refuse to let it go and incentivizes the studio to never let them go, because that rabid fan base is always going to be there. And that's where things can get kind of messy, and that's also why you end up wanting to have this other end of the spectrum of like, you can refine an idea until it's better and better and better and better and better indefinitely. There's always ways to improve it. You can make better Superman themes, you can make better Batman themes. But at a certain point, you got to ask the question, is refining this one thing the sum of what we can do? Or should we now make something else that replaces the need for a new Superman theme or a new Batman theme? I mean, like, the story Stan Lee tells about Spider-Man getting published all the time. At the end of the day, right, Spider-Man was a risk. It was a thing that no one wanted, no one thought they were going to get. The book was getting canceled. It was the last issue. So Stan Lee always tells a story about that's how he came up with Spider-Man, and he just threw it at the end of the book, and it took off. But where's the incentive for more people to do that, right? Where's the incentive for more people to be like, look, I've had enough goddamn Batman movies. I've had enough goddamn Batman comics. When's someone going to make a comic book superhero that's new and original and does something else, and we let that grow and blossom and be its own thing? Why does everything have to come back to fucking Batman?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, but the other problem is anytime you can point to something that is like successful, a lot of the times it's just the fucking store brand version of the main characters. So, and like,
that's the whole problem. Right?
Probably the most successful non-Marvel or DC comic adaptation out there would be like Invincible, right? And Invincible's just like, I really wish I could just be writing Superman right now. It's just not, though. And you're not writing Superman.
Invincible is also really funny to me, because I feel like people like shit on Invincible in a way that I feel like it's just kind of like hypocritical or mean. Like, I don't think Invincible is particularly good. I read the comics as a kid. I liked them up to a point, but it's not particularly good. It's just like, what if Superman was your dad and he was a dick and you were Spider-Man with Superman's powers? It's not a great comic by any stretch. The art kind of oscillates between good and terrible. It's got a lot of lazy industry jokes. It's got a lot of sexist subplots and shit. But every time I read Invincible and every time I watch episodes of the show, I'm like, people are demolishing this show for doing things that just every other superhero comic has always done. Why is Invincible special in people's hatred of it?
I feel like there's a very telling example that ties back to Ian's very specific, like the original prompt, right, of like something being important versus good, is I feel like once you get that label of importance, it becomes this very powerful like stat boost shield that makes anything that does the exact same thing you're doing, but it just came out afterwards, you got that label, is always gonna feel like the imitator. Like, for example, right, we can all agree, we're all intellectuals, we're all smart, free-thinking individuals. Darkseid is far better of a character than Thanos, correct? Like, it's not even comparison.
100%.
So, but because Thanos has been given the label of one of the greatest movie villains of all time now, any adaptation of Darkseid that is made is going to be criticized in the general audience for ripping off Thanos. Like, no matter what they do, no matter how good it is, it has that thing. Another good example is Russell Westbrook is an NBA player that is very inefficient, is very athletic, and in his prime would put up great numbers on a bad team. But he, despite playing very similarly to an early Michael Jordan, has not even nearly anywhere close the same amount of respect before Michael Jordan had any accomplishments, simply because Michael Jordan was the first of that breed of player, and anyone that comes afterwards is going to be compared not to Michael Jordan how he started out, is going to be compared to Michael Jordan how he ended with that illustrious legacy. And it's inherently, I think, the same way for any form of art. Is any comic book that's trying to come out, right, and gets an issue 1, it has something that's like a Detective Comics 27, right, and is a potential Spider-Man, Batman level success. The way things are set up and the way the industry is happy already having those, they're never going to get given the opportunity to grow and naturally become those huge monolithic myth icons that those earlier characters got to do. And that's something that's a part of a larger point that makes me really worried, because I see so many examples of this with how TV shows are run, or how video games are run, or how every form of art is in a much more, you have to kind of be perfect out the fucking gate now in a way that you never used to have to be. And it leads to a lot of good stuff, but it also leads to stuff that's just never given the shot to grow naturally. And that's normally how you got the really big, iconic franchises, was those growing pains. And I feel like that's something that just doesn't happen
100%.
anymore.
Yeah.
We talked about one already. Steve and I both agree. DS9 is a really good show. Fucking first 2 seasons of DS9 sucked so bad.
It's really hard to start, yeah. I mean, even TNG's the same way, right? Like, season 1 of TNG is atrocious, but then season 2 starts off great. The second Riker gets facial hair, it's great.
The second Roddenberry dies, they start doing like good stories.
Yeah, and this is also where when we talk about important versus good, the thing that is made is one aspect of it, but the other part of it that we could talk about is the person. And I know we're getting pretty far, but I feel like this might just be worth mentioning for a little bit. Is like Alan Moore is important to comic books in a way that is connected to, but not reducible to Watchmen. He's not. Watchmen is important for reasons, many reasons, but Alan Moore as a person and as an artist and as an influential voice in British and American comics is important in a whole different way. Everything about modern Superman-esque stories from like the 80s forward feels in a lot of senses just footnotes to what Alan Moore was doing with Marvel Man, Miracle Man. So much of like Omni-Man or the Plutonian or Injustice or like any variation of Superman, evil Superman from the 80s forward is just like, this is just what Alan Moore was doing with Marvel Man, Miracle Man. And so many storytellers in comics kind of made their careers on, I'm going to ape what Alan Moore does. I mean, case in point, Tom King. His whole career is footnotes to Alan Moore. And this becomes really important too, because like I think a person's most influential work is not necessarily their most important work as an artist. I make this distinction a lot when it comes to like the John Wick movies, where the most important John Wick movie is John Wick 1 because of when it landed and how it changed action movies and how much of an impact it made and the story behind its production. But is John Wick 1 the best John Wick movie? Probably not. If you were going to make a list of 100 greatest action movies of all time, you'd probably put John Wick 1 on there. But I would still say like John Wick 4 or John Wick 3 would be better. And that's one of those things where you get into this territory of like, to be important means that you also have to have an understanding of what you're making and constantly involve it. The reason someone like Martin Scorsese is an important filmmaker, or John Carpenter was an important horror filmmaker, or like Clint Eastwood now is like 95 years old and still directing movies, part of what makes them important is not the one thing that they make, but their whole history of making things and interrogating their instincts and evolving as artists. Everyone has a different favorite movie directed by Clint Eastwood, probably, but at the end of the day, when you talk about the most important American filmmakers of all time, Clint Eastwood's on there as the person, because he spent his career evolving and changing, and so much of what he did, you're not going to necessarily see like, this movie is clearly inspired by Unforgiven. Or this movie is clearly taking footnotes from Million Dollar Baby or whatever. But there's so few movies that you could point to now in that space where you're like, this person clearly watches Clint Eastwood's movies, because Clint Eastwood as an artist and how he changed is so important to them.
I like Clint Eastwood talking to a chair.
I think as well, just like inherently a good like kind of summation of it is it's a lot harder to be important than it is to be good.
That's a good point.
Yeah, like you will,
because there's factors that are completely out of your control.
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
right?
For sure.
Like, they happen more rarely now because it somehow seems that everything has like the ability to find someone who'll like champion it from day one now. But just things coming out at the right time, capturing the zeitgeist in a way that just kind of shocks even the person making it is always so absurd. Like, again, we'll go back to Alan Moore. I think it's really funny that Alan Moore still doesn't think The Killing Joke is very good. He's just not ready for it to be a good book. He doesn't see that he did a really good job on that one. And I think that's really, really amusing. Mm-hmm. And there's just there's like so many things of where, just because we're using the technology and just kind of thought of the right thing. A good one would be whoever the fuck made the decision on Spider-Verse to take just a weird rendering glitch that they had and then actually work it into a recurring visual motif in the film of changing the frame rates and dealing with like jitters and renders. Completely like changes the context of that movie. But also that like spawned a whole fucking thing of how we animate films now, which is crazy.
There's always
like, that kind of look cool. Let's keep doing that for the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
Okay. Next week.
There's also all these like you said, outside factors that you can't control, but like that help keep things important longer than they maybe have past their relevance. Like how many superhero comics that you see in print constantly are important and good, as opposed to just important because DC will not let them go out of print for whatever reason. Like Death in the Family, right? Like Death in the Family, every time
Death in the Family sucks.
it fucking sucks, right? You
Yeah,
you go to
it's
any website and you look up top 10 most the top 10 best Batman stories ever. Everyone puts Death in the Family up there, and every single person who does that has not read it, or they are lying. It is one or the other. It is they are lying, or that they have not read it, because it fucking sucks. But it's important, and it's always there, and it's always in print. Another good, timely, problematic example, J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, right? Like, Harry Potter's not good. It hit in a moment. I liked it when I was a kid. Some of the movies are pretty good. As an adult, you kind of grow out of it. It's not a big deal. But the sort of investment that Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling have in the constant moneymaker that is Harry Potter keeps it in the conversation and keeps it important well past its natural expiration date. And there are real-world consequences for that, but those are also things that you can't really control. Like, J.K. Rowling is a start of a very new breed of author that can get rich off of their books in a way that people before her couldn't. And there's a lot of growing pains to that and a lot of forces at play to keep her rich and keep her important in ways that are artificial, despite the fact that no one's read a fucking book she's written since Harry Potter.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really funny because, like, the big draw was, she was writing the Fantastic Beasts movies, and then those just fucking failed.
Those are so
hard.
bad. God, they're so bad.
I like the first one well enough, but there's just so many, like, things combining by the time the second movie came out. It's like, Johnny Depp is in this whole fucking situation with Amber Heard, and I've just come to the conclusion that both of them are terrible people. And, and then you got, like, that was when Rowling started getting, like, really, really turfy. Yep. Before, when the first movie had come out, like, she liked some tweets, but she hadn't really said any shit. And then she's just like, J.K. Rowling is now funding lawyers to sue trans people in different aspects of life. Damn.
Yeah, I mean, she's got a whole other book series that she's been publishing since Harry Potter ended, right? And, like, who the fuck has read any of those books? Because her as an author is not particularly good or important, but the way she stays in the news all the time, the way that she keeps Harry Potter relevant one way or the other, the way Warner Brothers won't let it die and doesn't want to piss her off, and the way that she realizes that she's not going to face any consequences for whatever she does or says and just uses her infinite money to make people's lives worse, all of that are things that keep her important that nobody could really control, right? Like, if you just threw a bunch of books into the wild and had a group of people pick up the ones that they like the most and see which ones become defining text for a civilization, that's a fun thought experiment of, like, how would people be able to do that? But the reason that doesn't happen in reality is there are all these other social forces that contribute to why a book stays important or relevant. Does it get translated? Does it stay in print? What countries does it stay in print in? Is it available in the library? Like, all of these things that just because you make a book or make a movie, you don't necessarily have control over.
Yep. It's wild. It's wild, the kinds of things that will, like, impact a story. I read through Les Mis, right? Like, and it's fucking long ass book.
Victor Hugo, man.
Yeah. And, like, it's a really interesting story, and there's a lot of, like, great stuff in it. But I remember just kind of, like, sitting, at certain points, I'm like, Victor, why are you talking about the Battle of Waterloo for 20 chapters? This has nothing to do with what's going on. And it's like, but it's still a really interesting part of French history. Okay, you know what? Fair. Why are you spending 5 chapters on the history of the nunnery that we like time skip over? Why? Why are we doing this? But at the same time, it's like, it's a very important book for the time. I think it is the story that, like, captures the zeitgeist of the post-French Revolution more than anything else ever has, and it's probably the book that has, like, come the closest to trying to explain where people's heads were and why the French Revolution was so much messier than, like, basically every other one. Every other notable revolution in history. Like, the Russian Revolution's messy, but like there's like a 2-year civil war and then it's settled, right? American Revolution's like surprisingly clean. And then you have like fucking every African revolution, which is just as messy as the French Revolution, but for different reasons.
And Spanish. Don't forget Spanish.
The Spanish Revolution's wild.
There's a lot happening there.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's like very directly over. Mm-hmm. Whereas the French Revolution might still be going. I'm not sure. I haven't checked up on it in a while.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to kind of put a pin on that point too, I think when you're talking about this distinction between good and being important, one thing that all of this kind of comes down to is whether you believe something is important or not, whether you believe something is good or not, is up to you. But if you
it's up to me.
It's up to you.
I am the decider.
Specifically, yeah.
Yes.
That's entirely up to you. But I do think that there is a certain level of like when you're talking about like Les Mis and the perspective it captures, or like reading books like Moby Dick or War and Peace or Crime and Punishment or like any of these big sort of daunting classics. There is a part of you that I think whether or not you like something, whether or not you agree with its importance, having the ability to kind of sit down and understand why is this thing considered and revered this way, either because of social circumstances or for like actual literary merit, is important just to enrich yourself. So like, is something good and important? Is something important and not good? Who knows? But if someone says something's important, maybe give it a try and see if you like it.
Yeah. All right, we're getting close to ending, but that does like raise a question, and I think it'll be like a good one to kind of end on. Have you recently read something or seen something blah 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 where you've just kind of gotten to the end and you're like, but why the fuck did anyone care? Like, why did anyone care about this? Why did this matter to anybody? Have you had just like a feeling of like being perplexed by something being important?
I don't know if I have, because normally, even if I really dislike something, I can understand why it hit for certain people, or I can have like sympathy for like, well, this was very specific to this people and they really enjoyed that it went off for them and stuff like that. Like My Hero Academia or something, right, is like something like I just have zero interest in. Like, I understand completely why it became popular. There was a vacuum at the time when it came out, and it had a very like standard premise to. There was like a big zeitgeist at that time of like superhero stuff that wasn't from Western comics that just kind of hit at the right moment. So I don't know if I can think of something where I was just like baffled that it got big. Yeah, I don't know about that.
We talked about Harry Potter earlier. And
I understand why Harry Potter got big. Though that's the issue. Is like I think it's terrible, but I think plenty of terrible things can become really successful. I don't think inherent quality is necessarily needed to hit it big. You know, like I think you just have to scratch a cultural itch at the right time, at the right place, and with something that can answer or fulfill a need that people want, you know? So I don't know, it you have to really, really stretch it to be like, I just don't get why this thing is... I think there is an example that's coming to head right now, I just, like, can't pin it down. But yeah, I think it might have been something more recent.
Mm.
Do you have anything,
Steve? Do you have anything?
I don't think so. I have so many blind spots in so many genres and mediums and stuff that like whenever someone tells me something's important, I just kind of take their word for it, and then I'll watch it or read it, and then I'll research why it was important and then satisfy the curiosity. So like if I watch something and I'm like, I don't get why this was important, I'll just go pull up an article of someone explaining to me why it was important. or I'll read something that says this is important. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to check this out now. So that context is always in my brain when I look at this kind of stuff. There's been plenty of things that got big that I don't like, or I don't get, on the sense that like it's not really for me, and I've got problems with it. But kind of like Alfie said, I'm usually not in the weeds of like, I don't have sympathy for why people would like it or why it would make a big sting. I remember years ago, Ian, you and I reviewed Jerry Maguire, and we just did not understand that movie at all, and neither of us liked it very much. And for a long time, that might have been it. Or like Forrest Gump's another big one where I'm like, I fucking hate Forrest Gump. Why the hell does anyone like this movie? But like it, as much as we don't like them, like it doesn't take very long to go online and read something from like the period or a retrospective and be like, oh, okay, I get it. I understand why people were into this.
Okay, fair enough.
You have something, Ian?
You know, I asked the question, sure that something was going to spawn in my head. And I guess, for me, it's a lot of, like, film things. I just don't fucking give a fuck how artistic or how important a thing is. Sometimes I'm just like, but it sucks ass. So... I'll probably piss both of you off if I say this. To an extent, Alien.
Ooh. Boy, oh boy.
It's one of those ones where, like, I keep going back to it. I'm like, nah, like, I get that it's technically well done, but I just don't fucking care for this movie. I don't get why people are just so obsessed with it. So it might be Alien.
I guess I'm just like... But you can understand, like, the xenomorph just from, like, a design aspect of, like, why that took off, right? Like, it's just kind of obvious. Like, oh, this thing... We'd never seen anything like this fucker before. Because that's really what you need sometimes, is just, like, a memorable design. It can carry a lot to get popular.
The other thing, too, is, like... I think everyone's going to have those things where, like, they're not in the community where this stuff is important or good or appreciated in that way. So from an outsider looking in, they're like, I don't get it, I don't like it, and that's totally fine. I'm that way with music. Like, you can tell me all day why the Beatles are the greatest band of all time. I'm sure that in the group of people who listen to music, this makes some kind of sense. But I don't...
Sgt. Pepper, I don't fucking get. Like, it's the very first concept album. Okay, what's the concept? It's that the Beatles are a different band.
Yeah, so, like, when you're outside looking in, this kind of stuff seems ridiculous, and then if you're in looking out and you hear us say this, you're like, these guys don't know anything about the Beatles. I'm like, and you're right. I don't know jack shit about the Beatles. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I probably never will. So, like, that's a different thing, I think, like what you're saying with film, to, like, being inside of a group and having that dissenting voice. Like, I'm really, really into, like, Gundam, for example. And the thing that I don't get inside the Gundam space is, like, why the fuck does everyone like Gundam Wing so much? Gundam Wing fucking sucks. It's just the original series, but worse. I don't get it. But that's a different thing. Because I already understand inside that group what the standing of Gundam Wing is and why it matters to certain people versus others and stuff like that. So that's the thing where I feel like you have to kind of, if you're not receptive to being part of that group to begin with, then you're just never going to have a good answer to that question. When you're inside a specific group and you're like the lone dissenting voice and you can't find a reason, then that's sort of the more interesting one. Citizen Kane was like this for a really long time. Citizen Kane was not considered a great movie when it came out, and it took years. It took until like the late 50s or 60s when someone did a retrospective on Citizen Kane for people to understand, oh, actually, Citizen Kane is really good. So, like, when you're inside the movie people, and the movie people have a poor opinion of Citizen Kane, and then the movie person's like, no, actually, Citizen Kane is great for these reasons. And then you start changing the culture inside of it. That's a very different thing, I think. And I'm sure, like, in the 60s, whoever wrote that essay about Citizen Kane explaining why it was great, probably felt like one of us would have felt like, I don't understand why all you people are crazy and you don't love this.
Yeah.
Just you hearing you two talk, I did come up with two examples. One for each of your points, Steve. One where I'm not in the fandom, and one where I am in the fandom. So an interesting one and not interesting. My interesting in the fandom one, I guess, recently would just be Daima. It feels like I'm kind of like alone a lot of the time, and I'm like, I don't think Daima worked like at all.
Do people like Daima?
People love Daima.
What?
People love everything about Daima, specifically because of like Super Saiyan 4 and like everything. And I'm just like,
God.
and I just look at like the original, see like just if you could just compare the transformation scenes, I'm like, but this one had like pathos and like
thematic resonance.
Character, and then this one's just here because he got like zapped by a Namekian. Like, what are we doing here, guys? But okay, you like this one more because it's redder now. So I feel like that with Daima. I'm in the Dragon Ball fandom. Every time I bring it up to other Dragon Ball fans, and I'm like, oh yeah, I don't like Daima. And they're like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You're just a hater. I was like, no, I really liked it at the beginning when it was focused, and then it just completely went off the fucking rails. But my outside one that will probably piss, I think will piss at least Ian off. I don't think I know your opinion on this. I don't get why people fought so hard so many times to keep bringing back Futurama. I don't get Futurama. The big for that. I think they were correct to cancel it the first. I don't think it's that good of a pitch. I don't get the Futurama love. Like, it would be fine just like as like a one-off show, but like the fact that how many times they kept fucking bringing that back, I was like, what is there to keep? What more is to be said? You know?
Ian and I had a conversation about this when the latest Hulu revival happened, where it's like every time Futurama gets canceled, it takes a few episodes before it gets good again. So the revival's pretty bad, but don't worry, it'll get better.
I guess I'm just so outside of. I've seen like a couple episodes and stuff, and like there's some funny bits. Like it's still talented people involved. I'm just like the sheer degree of like how many fucking chances it's got. You know, is what just baffles me compared to other things.
I mean, I could explain it to you. I guess it's the fact that it just built such a cult following. The exact same thing happened to Family Guy that happened with Futurama, which is it did its initial like 2 or 3 seasons or whatever, and then Fox pulled it from the air because they didn't believe in it. They didn't care for it. It's like, okay, well, we got your stuff, and it's not really doing much in the ratings, so bye. And then Cartoon Network through Adult Swim needed content because you can't just put the fucking national anthem on and just not broadcast 24
hours of Robot Chicken.
Yeah. So they needed content, so they got the re-air rights to Family Guy and Futurama, and they would just put blocks of that on Adult Swim all night, along with other shit. But like they would put blocks of that on all night, and that like the fact that, you know, just being a kid growing up watching Adult Swim and seeing Family Guy and Futurama when it was undeniably good over and over and over again just built such like a cult following into these things. And I remember, and it's so weird to think about, I remember watching like for a season, or not a season, for like throughout the summer of, I want to say 2005 or whatever, they had Seth MacFarlane in live action for Adult Swim introducing episodes of Family Guy. And then it was like the Family Guy Goodbye Adult Swim season, because Adult Swim had gotten Family Guy renewed, but in doing so it became too expensive for Adult Swim to be able to rebroadcast anymore. But Seth MacFarlane was so grateful to them that he like came in to do this like farewell kind of thing for it or whatever. And the exact same thing happened with Futurama. Like, I remember Futurama's last episode to re-air on Adult Swim, and they said, "We thought your contract would never end. Goodbye, Futurama." So it's really that it just built such a cult following because the peak of both of them. And I like a lot of the revival stuff that happened with Futurama, but nothing was as good as those initial couple seasons. So it's just the fact that like you got built up on the peak that you just needed it to come back. Revivals are... Someone write that down. Revivals are a good fucking topic.
I mean, this is a good sort of microcosm of the whole point, right? Of like, Alfie, you're outside the Futurama fandom, you don't get it, you haven't watched too much of it, and then Ian goes into the explanation of like what Futurama did within that context, and suddenly you have a new perspective on it, and if you wanted to watch like the first 4 or 5 seasons, maybe there'd be a different level of appreciation now.
Right.
Yeah. And also, I mean, just fucking the robot devil saying,
"Oh God,
this play lacks substance. Your characters are just saying how they feel. You can't do that. That makes me feel angry."
I like that devil character. He's got a good VO.
Futurama
Just really
rules.
good writing.
That's a good fucking show. Their Star Trek episode is so funny too. We've been talking about Star Trek.
Yeah, there we go. It all comes back to Futurama in the end.
I think that also lines up with this. Star Trek is also something I just know. So I think y'all Futurama and Star Trek seem to have a very overlapped fan base as part of it.
They definitely do. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Star Trek's like a commitment and a half, and I'm not even sure it's necessarily worth it. Whereas Futurama,
I had my Doctor Who trenches. I'm good. I'm out.
I think if you're going to watch anything Star Trek at all, I do think legitimately Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan's a great movie, and that's worth watching at some point, even if you have no context. And then if you can get through the first couple seasons of DS9, I think they're worth it.
We'll see. Maybe if we do Wrath of Khan as a GG episode, I'll watch it.
Yeah, maybe. Alrighty. Well, I think that does it for this episode. This is a good one. I wasn't sure if we would, like... As soon as we got into it, Steve was like, well, I think the answer, of course, is it's complicated. I was like, oh, fuck. There goes the whole episode. Steve just got right to the fucking point, didn't he? And no, but we got some mileage out of it. So
we
good.
made it work. We thought that Steve and his giving answers upfront bullshit. Don't worry, we made it work.
Alrighty. Until next time, everyone, I'm the philosopher.
I am the champion of importance.
And I'm the good one.
And we're your geeky gentlemen. And we will be discussing things. Like, what do you mean the good one? Like
You'll say.
you deserve a fucking treat?
Yeah,
or...
man. I'm a good boy. Where's my candy?